Making headlines for this week of July 15th. Faux coup. Current evidence suggests Turk president orchestrated action against himself. The secret 28. Formerly classified pages of 9/11 official report are released, and questions arise. Breaking and birthing. Old economic paradigm goes down, transition paradigm comes up, and a hint of evolution beyond economics. And rule of law. What are leaders really claiming when they say they want rule of law in any country?
With news around, upon, within, and beyond our planet, the program making disclosure official. This is Cosmic Vision News. Here is Jeffrey West.
Greetings and blessings to all. Interesting developments have begun unfolding in Turkey as of July 15th. Late in the evening local time, news began to break of a military coup that was apparently underway in that country. Euronews, in an article on its website on the 15th, reported the following. The Turkish military has released a statement saying they have taken control of the country in the name of democratic order, although Prime Minister Binali Yildirim warned that it is wrong to refer to the event as a coup. Yildirim added that the military are acting outside of the chain of command and security forces are working to resolve the situation. The government elected by the people remains in charge. This government will only go when the people say so, he remarked earlier. He said those responsible for the attempted coup will pay the highest price. Yildirim insisted that the government remained in power, although unnamed military sources said it had taken over for democratic order. Turkey has had its share of protests and unrest. President Recep Erdogan has been accused of using force in the past against popular protests against his administration. Euronews, however, reported that the events on the 15th were a minority coup and urged people to take to the streets to protest against the coup d'etat. What I find a little bit concerning about that is that if I were a leader and I was truly concerned about the lives of those who elected me, I would not call them out onto the streets during an event of this nature. The people would not be able to do much unless Erdogan was hoping that they would be more of a distraction to the forces attempting to remove him from office. As we will hear in a few minutes, perhaps there was another reason Erdogan would have wanted people out there on the street. Euronews also further reported in the same article that the statement that confirms events as a coup d'etat are being announced by the state broadcaster TRT. It says that the country's democratic and secular rule has been corrupted by the current administration and that Turkey will now be run by a peace council to ensure the safety of the Turkish people. According to the TRT announcer, a new constitution will be put into place as soon as possible. Press TV from Iran reported that the Turkish army says it has taken power over the country and that the rule of law must remain a priority. The statement added that the military aims to reinstall the constitutional order, democracy, human rights, and freedoms, and to ensure that the rule of law once again reigns in the country for the law and order to be reinstated. All international agreements and commitments will remain. We pledge that good relations with all world countries will continue, the military statement said. Coming up shortly in the newscast, I'll look a bit more at this term called rule of law. For many around the world, it may be a bit confusing about what is going on in Turkey and whose side the Turkish government is really on. At the moment, the evidence appears to show that the government, although it may have been democratically elected at one point, does not necessarily mean that it will serve those interests with honor and integrity. This was witnessed in Canada under the former leadership of Stephen Harper, but it can be applied basically to every Western government, past and current, to varying degrees. It was in January of 2015, the German news site Der Spiegel reported that Istanbul prosecutor Zakaria Oz has investigated Turkey's elite, those who were seen as untouchable, politicians, journalists, attorneys, and generals. Ouz has been the most important criminal prosecutor under Erdogan, helping him to take legal measures against the network known as the Ergenekon, whose members were allegedly planning a coup against the government. But only a few months after the end of the 5-year trial, Ouz has now turned against his former sponsor. Shortly before Christmas, police arrested more than 50 suspects, including politicians with the ruling Justice and Development Party, influential business people, and the sons of 3 cabinet ministers. The investigations were initiated by Ouz, who was subsequently taken off the case. The scandal has taken Erdogan into the most serious crisis of his nearly 11 years in office. The corruption scandal within his inner circle is jeopardizing the power of the AKP and threatens to tear it apart, and that in an election year in which Erdogan apparently wants to be elected president. Remember, this was in 2015. The corruption probe went further. Germany's Deutsche Welle news site reported also at that time in 2015 that Ugur Bayraktutan, a member of the main opposition Republican People's Party, CHP, is one of the opposition politicians demanding that Turkey's prime minister, and this is what Erdogan was back in 2015, he was urged to make public his family's ties to Saudi Arabian businessman Yassin al-Qadi. Within a month, Erdogan must reply to the request. Bayraktutan wants to know whether Bilal Erdogan actually met with al-Qadi, as the media have reported. Al-Qadi was here illegally. We have photos to prove it, Bayraktutan told Deutsche Welle. The corruption probe led to the massive protests in the country in the first month of 2015 by people who had become dissatisfied by Erdogan's leadership. Now, before I continue with this part of the story, it is important to go back a little bit in history to get some background that is relevant. Zero Hedge, in an article on November 25th, reported on the shooting down of a Turkish jet in 2012 that Syria claimed was in its territory, but Turkey had said was not. After presentation of the proof that the plane was in Syrian territory, the Turkish leadership expressed rage at that time regarding the decision to shoot down the F-4 Phantom on June 22, 2012. Erdogan at that time, in 2012, described Syria as a clear and present threat, and he was quoted as saying that a short-term border violation can never be a pretext for an attack. Fast forward now to November of 2015, and the conflict against Daesh, also known as ISIS, would add fuel to the fire of allegations of corruption against the Erdogan government. On November 24th of 2015, the BBC reported that Turkey had shot down a Russian jet that Turkey claimed was in Turkish airspace. The Russians claimed the jet was not. 2 days later, CNN reported Erdogan as saying that Turkey will not apologize for downing a Russian fighter jet that it says violated Turkish airspace near the Syrian border, said President Erdogan in an exclusive CNN interview. I think if there is a party that needs to apologize, it is not us, he said from the Turkish capital in the interview. Those who violated our airspace are the ones who need to apologize. Our pilots and our armed forces, they simply fulfilled their duties, which consisted of responding to violation of the rules of engagement. I think this is the essence. So there was a hypocritical action in this relating to the events of 2012 compared to the present Turkish downing of the Russian jet. On November 13th, 2015, Mint Press News reposted an article from Zero Hedge reporting the following. Russia's Sergei Lavrov is not one foreign minister known to mince his words. Just earlier today, 24 hours after a Russian plane was brought down by the country whose president 3 years ago said a short-term border violation can never be a pretext for an attack, this is what Lavrov had to say. We have serious doubts this was an unintended incident and believe this is a planned provocation by Turkey. According to a press release from Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov pointed out that by shooting down a Russian plane on a counter-terrorist mission of the Russian aerospace force in Syria, and one that did not violate Turkey's airspace, the Turkish government has, in effect, sided with ISIS, or Daesh. The main purpose of this article was to highlight Turkey's connections with Daesh, and in this article the focus was on Erdogan's son Bilal. The article reported that the Russian minister reminded his counterpart about Turkey's involvement in the Daesh illegal trade in oil, which is transported via the area where the Russian plane was shot down, and about the terrorist infrastructure, arms and munitions depots and control centers that are also located there. Retired French General Dominique Trican supported the Russian position, stating that Turkey is either not fighting Daesh at all or very little, and does not interfere with different types of smuggling that takes place on its border, be it oil, phosphate, cotton, or people. The article asks the following question: who is the one breaching every known law of funding terrorism when buying Daesh crude oil, almost certainly with the tacit approval by various Western alliance governments? And why is it these governments have allowed these middlemen to continue funding Daesh for as long as they have allowed it? The article answers the question that one name that continues to appear as the primary culprit of regional demand for Daesh terrorist oil is the name of Erdogan's son, Bilal. At that time, according to the article, the prime source of money feeding Daesh these days is sale of Iraqi oil from the Mosul region oil field, where they maintain a stronghold. The son of Erdogan, it seems, is the man who makes the export sales of Daesh-controlled oil possible. But Bilal wasn't the only Erdogan child to be connected to Daesh. It had been reported a few months earlier on the WND.com news site that a former nurse has revealed that she was employed at a secret Turkish hospital used to treat wounded Daesh soldiers near the Syrian border, run by Sümeyye Erdogan, daughter of President Erdogan. The nurse, who did not reveal her name for fear of retaliation, is a member of the Alawite faith, a minority offshoot of Shia Islam, according to an investigative report released by the Montreal-based Center for Research on Globalization. I was given a generous salary of $7,500, but they were unaware of my religion, she told investigators. The fact is that I adhere to the Alawite faith, and since Erdogan took the helm of the country, the system shows utter contempt for the Alawite minority, the nurse added. She said she was forced out of her position because hospital officials began treating her unfairly when they learned that she was a member of the minority sect. They had no confidence in Alawites, the nurse said. Hers is just the latest charge that the Erdogan government is secretly assisting Daesh in its war against Syria's Assad regime, a charge the administration has repeatedly denied. This becomes significant because Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his wife are of the same Alawite minority. All of these historical events, and likely others, are contributing to the events now underway in Turkey. A little more than 2 weeks ago, in what came as a surprise to many, Turkey did a 180-degree about-face. And for those who do not fully understand English, this means a complete turnaround in its position against Russia. Numerous news media, including the London Guardian, reported on or around June 27th that the Kremlin has said that the Turkish president has apologized for the downing of a Russian jet last year that ruined the country's relations and highlighted the grave dangers of rising regional tensions over the war in Syria. Erdogan expressed regret to Russian President Putin over the incident, insisting that Turkey never had the desire or deliberate intention of shooting down the Russian Federation's plane, and was ready to do everything possible to restore friendly ties, according to a Kremlin statement. In his letter to Russian President Putin, Erdogan wrote, "I once again express my sympathy and profound condolences to the family of the Russian pilot who was killed, and I apologize to them." So, after a year of refusing to apologize and then suddenly reaching out to Russia in an effort to restore good relations, one cannot help but wonder why. What did or does Erdogan know? It is possible that he knew that a military coup was coming, and as we'll find out in a moment, the evidence seems to support that and more, and that his day of reckoning for all his activities were catching up to him. Was the NATO leadership about to come down hard on Turkey? At least three questions could be asked at this point. What triggered the sudden shift by Erdogan to apologize for something that he said that he would absolutely not apologize for? 2. Was the coup a punishment for Erdogan's reaching out to Russia in the east through the issuance of the apology in Turkey's desire to break free of the West? Was Erdogan scared of being thrown under the bus, in other words? And this appears now to not be the case. Or 3, was the movement of Turkey towards the east always planned, and the removal of a corrupt Erdogan was necessary in order for this to take place? Again, this question appears to not be the case at this time. As has been reported on CVN over the last couple of weeks, the NATO summit was recently held in Warsaw, Poland. Is it possible that this gesture by Turkey is merely a ruse, an attempt to sucker punch Putin and Russia, or perhaps something else? And this appears more and more to be the case. Consider the following. RT reported on March 29th. Citing security concerns in Turkey, the Department of Defense has ordered the evacuation of U.S. military families and civilians from Adana, Izmir, and Mugla, as well as the Incirlik air bases. Nearly 700 dependents are affected by this order. This decision allows for the deliberate, safe return of family members from these areas due to continued security concerns in the region, the U.S. European Command, EUCOM, said in a statement Tuesday afternoon. According to EUCOM Chief General Philip Breedlove, the decision was made in consultation with the Turkish government, the State Department, and the U.S. Secretary of Defense. In March, the situation was allegedly serious enough that the U.S. would withdraw family members under the public story of safety. It would seem pretty clear that the U.S. was expecting something. Were they beginning to think that Turkey would defect to the east, or was it a facade to make Russia think one thing and lure them into some kind of conflict, to further attempt to demonize or otherwise blame Russia for some future event? Is it possible that it could be tied to a situation involving Israel and Iran? I do not pretend to know every angle that is going on here, but it is my hope that by presenting as many different reports and perspectives as possible, perhaps one may begin to see how important it is to simply not judge an outcome based on a single media report. It is important to try to look at any geopolitical event in a broader context and to try to see that there are many, many more than just one angle to anything that is going on. There are interconnections within interconnections. Now, taking a look at some of the more recent events since July 15th, evidence appears to be mounting now that the coup was orchestrated by Erdogan himself in an attempt to further solidify his power and control in the country. There are suggestions being made that Erdogan is attempting to justify the creation of an Islamic superstate. RT reported on July 16th the following. The preacher who has been accused by the Turkish government of trying to seize power in a military coup has hit back, appearing to accuse Erdogan of conducting a deadly false flag operation and comparing him to Hitler. There is a possibility that it could be a staged coup by Mr. Erdogan's AKP party, and it could be meant for further accusations against the Gülenists and the military. Fethullah Gülen, who is in exile in Pennsylvania, told the media on Saturday. Erdogan, who has habitually accused Gülen and his popular Hizmet movement of trying to overthrow him ever since the two former allies fell out in 2013, called on the U.S. to extradite Gülen. There is also this information to consider, as reported by Asaf Ronel on Israel's Haaretz news website on July 16. Ronell writes that 6 senior army commanders were arrested in connection with the failed coup that began Friday night, including General Akin Öztürk, who in the 1990s was the Turkish military attaché to Israel, a Turkish official told reporters. Öztürk, who later served as the commander of Turkey's Air Force, served in his country's Tel Aviv embassy from 1998 to 2000. The 64-year-old military figure stepped down as Air Force commander last year, but has continued to serve on Turkey's Supreme Military Council. Though now, today, considered an archenemy of Turkish authorities and particularly of Erdogan, he was, prior to Friday's coup attempt, a celebrated military leader, boasting medals from his own Air Force as well as from NATO, the Israeli news website Ynet noted. There are many things about what happened in Turkey that just simply don't add up. The website disclose.tv offered these thoughts. Erdogan was struggling with approval lately. Thus, he orchestrated a coup during which, inexplicably, a lot of civilians were injured, killed, or at least fired upon, in contrast to the past 4 coup attempts where the military focus was solely on government. Now he has a legitimate reason to cut civil liberties even more, suppress all opposition, and become a de facto dictator with little resistance from the international community. And since he smacked down a coup by dangerous psychos killing civilians and not a legitimate opposition, he will walk away looking like the hero protecting his people. Also consider how quickly this ended and the small part of the military that was involved. All previous coup attempts have been orchestrated nationwide by huge portions of the military. The question I might pose at this point: could the deaths of the civilians have been prevented had Erdogan not demanded that citizens get out to protest the coup? Just as there have been snipers and agents provocateurs at numerous false flag events, including Maidan Square in Kiev during the Ukraine coup to install a Western puppet, were there perhaps snipers present in Turkey to kill civilians so that the coup planners could be blamed and Erdogan could look like the hero? More details may arise for next week's newscast. For now, the evidence appears to suggest that Erdogan staged the event himself to prop up his image, his power, and his agenda. However, I ask you not to accept what I share as truth, because there are still far too many factors, known and unknown, that must still come forth to understand better exactly the strategy and the agenda that is in play at this time in Turkey. In other geopolitical news, a second late developing story on Friday also began to unfold in the afternoon of July 15th, and this story focuses on the release of 28 pages that were not originally released to the public in the official report of the events of 9/11. Press TV from Iran reported on the 15th that the U.S. government has released 28 pages of a congressional report on the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, which show the Saudi government may have had a hand in those events. The article quoted the following from one of the 28 pages released. While in the United States, some of the September 11th hijackers were in contact with and received support or assistance from individuals who may be connected to the Saudi government, reads part of the report released. This is information primarily from FBI sources that at least 2 of those individuals were allegedly by some to be Saudi intelligence officers. In their testimony, neither CIA nor FBI witnesses were able to identify definitively the extent of Saudi support for terrorist activity globally or within the United States. It might seem that something is beginning to shift within the U.S. government, and perhaps it means that some politicians may be looking for ways to redeem themselves before the hangman comes to get them. The article notes that President Obama, under pressure from Congress and the public, announced in April that the secret pages, which have been kept out of public view since 2002, would be declassified soon. RT was a little bit more bold in its story, stating the following with more certainty. The declassified documents were released by Congress on Friday, and the documents confirmed suspicions that the terrorists involved in the 9/11 attacks, most of whom were Saudi nationals, likely received support from high-ranking Saudi intelligence officers. Of course, this is still only one small part of the story, because there are still 1,010 different questions relating to the events of 9/11 that still need to be evaluated. Some questions worth considering. Why was there no plane in the field in Pennsylvania where one of the jets allegedly went down? Why do some of the videos show the planes almost disappearing into the Twin Towers before there is any breaking of glass and any explosions? Why was there only a hole in the Pentagon and not the damage or outline of a plane with wings hitting the target? How could 3 buildings fall at free fall speed and completely into their own footprint? How could one of those buildings even collapse when it was not even hit by a plane, when the building was alleged to contain all the paperwork relating to an announcement by Donald Rumsfeld the day before that the U.S. Defense Department had lost track of over $2 trillion? How do steel buildings melt into molten steel when burning jet fuel cannot reach a temperature hot enough to melt steel? Why are there pictures showing some of the steel beams within the Twin Towers having diagonal cuts, the very same kind used in controlled demolition? If the planes allegedly disintegrated inside the Twin Towers, how could a completely undamaged passport of one of the alleged hijackers end up on the ground? Why did BBC report Building 7 as having collapsed before it happened? Why did Larry Silverstein, the owner of the World Trade Center complex, take out a $3 billion insurance policy on the building less than 6 months before the event? Why was he also caught on tape as saying that the building must be pulled, a term for a controlled demolition? What was the lone white plane that was filmed in the sky when all planes were allegedly grounded? Was the bin Laden family on board one of the only planes that was allowed to leave U.S. airspace on the morning of September the 11th? Why have so many first responders ended up getting sick and many have died afterwards? The answer to this one is believed to be the asbestos that was in the buildings and is alleged to be one of the reasons why these buildings were used as an excuse to build new buildings instead of paying the cost for removing the asbestos. The questions, as far as I'm concerned, go on and on and on. This is just a very small sample, but these questions and more are the kinds of questions that everyone needs to start asking politicians and anyone who serves in political office, not only in the U.S., but all Western countries. Indeed, all Western governments are complicit in the fraud, fear, extortion, and crime against humanity for not speaking up on this false flag event. The RT article included also the following information. The report cautions that the information presented should not be taken as a complete or perfectly reliable assessment of the information presented, since it is largely a compilation of FBI and CIA documents. It was not the task of this joint inquiry to conduct the kind of extensive investigation that would be required to determine the true significance of any such alleged connection to the Saudi government, it said. However, the report did indicate that information it presented strongly points to elements of the Saudi government having had a hand in the 9/11 event. It is possible that these kinds of connections could suggest, quote, incontrovertible evidence that there is support for these terrorists within the Saudi government, unquote, the report said, quoting a document from July of 2002, which had its name redacted. On the other hand, the report stated, continuing, it is also possible that further investigation of these allegations could reveal legitimate, and innocent explanations for these associations. Assuming that this is what is actually printed on one of those 28 pages, then it confuses me as to why this information would be kept out of the public for so long. If there was an innocent explanation for the alleged associations, then would it not have been more prudent to simply come forth with one of those explanations, even if it was a completely fabricated lie? So in my mind, there is still a deeper reason as to why this information would have been kept out. The logical theory to look at, if we were to follow the money, as the expression goes, is to look at the U.S.-Saudi Arabia relations at the time. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia were strong allies at that point, and the U.S. was still very dependent upon Saudi oil. And since the U.S. dollar status as a global reserve currency depended on oil, then it would explain how the power controllers could capitalize on the stock market panic during the manufactured crisis. Longtime CVN listeners will know the name John Perkins, author of the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I came across a video of a presentation he delivered back in 2007. He explains the process, which I aired a few weeks back, and I will not repeat this week. This clip brings a lot into a clearer perspective. We understand the role of Saudi Arabia in the ultimate control of the Middle East, the purpose of Israel, and what happened in Iraq. The audio clip starts at the point where he has finished explaining the process of what an economic hitman does, going into a country to more or less threaten the leaders, and then addresses what happens when the economic hitman fail in their mission, and then look at Saudi Arabia.
Sometimes we fail, not very often. I failed miserably in Panama with Omar Torrijos. I personally, and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos. And I've detailed this in the book, but what happens then is what we call the jackals go in. The jackals overthrow governments, as we tried to do in 2002 with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or they assassinate the leaders of these governments, as they did with Jaime Roldos in Ecuador and Omar Torrijos in Panama. I felt deeply guilty for that, because I particularly liked Torrijos, who I knew quite well personally, and I knew that if I failed to bring him around, the jackals were likely to step in, and they did. He died in a fiery airplane crash. I have no doubt it was a CIA orchestrated assassination done by jackals. On the few occasions when the jackals also fail, then, and only then, does the military go in. That's what happened in Iraq. To understand Iraq, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my perspective on Iraq in just a minute, but to really understand it, we first have to understand Saudi Arabia. A lot of you will remember, some of you won't. I'd like to see we get quite a generational mix here. In the early 70s, OPEC didn't like what we were doing in Israel. Same old story. And so they cut off our oil supplies. So some of you will remember these long lines at the gas stations. And we feared we were going to have another depression like the 1929 depression. And so the U.S. Treasury Department came to me and other economic hitmen and said, listen, you know, we can't allow OPEC to blackmail us anymore. You guys got to come up with a plan so this will never happen again. We knew that that plan had to involve Saudi Arabia because it had more oil than anybody else, and it also, the House of Saud, the royal family, was corrupt and corruptible. The long version is explained in the book, but the short version of what we did, the deal we finally struck with the House of Saud, was a deal whereby they would return almost all the money they made from selling oil to the United States invested in U.S. government securities. The U.S. Treasury Department would use the interest from those securities, which over the years has amounted to trillions of dollars, to hire U.S. companies to westernize Saudi Arabia, build petrochemical complexes, desalinization plants, whole cities out of the desert, McDonald's and all the other things that go along with our Western culture. The House of Saud would also agree to keep the price of oil within limits acceptable to the oil companies, possibly not acceptable to you and me, but acceptable to the oil companies. And this is very, very important. They agree that they would never, ever sell oil for anything other than U.S. dollars. This happened in the early 70s, right after we'd gone off the gold standard because we were bankrupt, because we could not pay off our debts to European countries in gold. Nixon took us off the gold standard. And then we were stuck with a situation as why will anybody in the world use dollars? So very shortly we came up with this plan, which in essence put the dollar on the oil standard. You cannot buy oil on the world market for anything other than dollars, and that's very important to the corporatocracy. Our part of the bargain was we agreed to keep the House of Saud in power, in control. It was an amazing deal, the deal of the century. It was history-making, incredibly powerful deal that we struck with Saudi Arabia, and it's held. It's had some what the CIA calls blowback, unintended consequences. For example, one of the things that really pisses Osama bin Laden off is those McDonald's and those desalinization plants and those petrochemical complexes surrounding Medina and Mecca, the two most sacred sites in Islam. And it pisses off a lot of other Muslims in Indonesia and all over the world. There's been some blowback, but on the whole, the corporatocracy looked at this as an incredible success. I had done my job. We economic hitmen did a great job with that one. So we decided that Saddam Hussein ought to accept something very similar. Now, probably a lot of you know that Saddam has been our boy for a very, very long time. You may remember Abdul Karim Qasim, who was president of Iraq in the early 60s. Qasim came up with a unique concept. He said Iraqi oil ought to go to benefit the Iraqi people. How novel is that? Well, we didn't like that very much. He began to tax the oil companies, particularly the British and some American companies, and threatened to nationalize our oil companies. And so we decided that Qasim had to go. The CIA sent in an assassination team. It was headed by a man who was still going through high school, an Iraqi citizen who was still going through high school. They riddled Qasim's car with bullets on the streets of Baghdad and missed him. The head of this assassination team was wounded and fled to Syria. His name was Saddam Hussein. He was a CIA agent in those days, an assassin for us. He failed. And so the CIA went directly, and this is all history, I'm not creating this. CIA went in and had Qasim publicly executed on Iraqi television. They put Saddam's cousin in charge. He became president of Iraq, and Saddam became vice president in charge of security. Eventually, as you know, he became president. He was our boy. He was our man. And so, and we sold him and gave him a lot of tanks. We built him Bechtel, built him big chemical. I don't know, my father-in-law was chief architect at Bechtel. Built Saddam big chemical plants that were used, and we knew that they were used to make mustard gas and other chemical weapons that were being employed against the Kurds and later the Iranians. We knew this, but we sold him these things. And in the 1980s, we decided that Saddam Hussein ought to accept something similar to Saudi Arabia. Such a successful deal, because after all, what we want to do is control the Middle East and control the oil in the Middle East. And incidentally, I'm going to get back to Iraq in just a moment. But for those of you who think that Israel is about creating a homeland for the Jewish people, you're as deceived as most of them are. It's partly about that, perhaps, but what it's really about is creating a surrogate fortress in the middle of the Middle East. The Israelis are being used as pawns. They're being used like old armies used to use sheep that ran before the armies. They're our surrogates. And their leadership knows that. Most Israelis probably don't. They think they're creating a homeland. But it's a very, very sad situation of what's going on there. And of course, the Lebanese and the Palestinians are caught in the middle of this. And Iraq is part of that too. We have to remember that Middle Eastern oil is the oil that's used by a great deal of Europe, China, and Japan. If we control Middle Eastern oil, we control our biggest potential competitors, Japan, China, Europe. So it's very important that we do that. So in the 80s, we decided that Saddam ought to accept the same sort of deal that the Saudis had accepted. The economic hitmen went in and did their job on him, but he wouldn't buy. He'd been our man, but he wouldn't buy. If he had, he'd still be president of Iraq, and we'd be selling him all the tanks and fighter jets and all the chemical plants he wants. But he wouldn't buy. So we sent in the jackals. They couldn't take him out. His security was very good, and he had many doubles, many lookalikes. Now, in the case of both Roldos and Torrijos, the way we assassinate presidents like that, well, let me ask you a question. If you're the president of a country and you're surrounded by men with AK-47s and other heavy armaments, your bodyguards, and somebody wants to assassinate you, who's the most likely candidate to be your assassin? Your bodyguards, particularly if they happen to be trained at the School of the Americas. And Roldos' and Torrijos' bodyguards were trained at the School of the Americas. Almost all of them were. Now, we all know that men like that, trained in those schools, are usually pretty loyal to their trainers, their mentors. They were also very underpaid. And so, for example, in the case of Torrijos, what we did was go up to one of his bodyguards, sent his teacher from the School of the Americas to a couple of his bodyguards who were making about $10,000 a year. And the mentors went in, the teachers went in and said, look, you know, you'd be doing this country a great service if you get rid of this man, this Torrijos. You've got to get him out of here. And incidentally, here's $100,000. You're only making $10,000 a year, so it's a pretty good deal. We could do that. In the case of Iraq, Saddam had been our man. He had been our assassin. He knew our ways. He knew how to protect himself. He had damn good security and all these look-alike doubles. Now, what's the stupidest thing you can do if you're bodyguard to a president? Shoot his double. And if you never know who you're guarding and somebody offers you a high price to shoot somebody and you don't even know who you're guarding, you're probably not going to do it because, by God, if you shot Saddam's double, you and your family and everybody else you ever ran into on the streets, life wouldn't be worth much, would it? So we couldn't take him out. So in '91 we sent in the military, our military, and some of you who were there. We could have taken Saddam out at that time, and I think you who were there probably know that better than anybody else. But we didn't want to. Saddam was the type of man the corporatocracy likes. The strong man, could keep his people under control. He could keep the Iranians under control on their borders pretty well. He could keep the Kurds under control. We thought that when we took out his military, he would be sufficiently chastised that now he would buy our deal. So the economic hitmen went back to work on him in the 90s. Couldn't bring him around again, though. Again, if they had, he'd still be there. The assassins couldn't take him out again. So once again, the military went in. And they're still there. Of course, if we'd struck that deal with him, we would be building, our Bechtels and Halliburtons would be building huge cities there and petrochemical complexes, just like they've done in Saudi Arabia. And of course, that's what they're doing there now, too, in a different way. But that's what this is all about. That's what these wars are about. From my perspective, that's what Iraq is about. Iraq is a classic case of failure.
Today, however, diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia appear to be breaking, and the U.S. dollar falls into its grave as a global reserve currency. The power of the global cabal is fracturing on numerous fronts, and big oil is rapidly falling by the wayside as new energies are increasingly taking their rightful place within the world. As corruption is exposed on numerous levels within each country, allies gradually attempt to distance themselves from various scandals. The House of Saud is under intense pressure and scrutiny, as is the government of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, and also several other countries. At first glance, the information contained in these 28 pages does not seem to be especially damaging, and therefore this begs the question of why the information needed to be covered up in the first place and why for so long. The U.S. Congress voted in April to allow Saudi Arabia to be held accountable for the events of 9/11. This would appear to be a win for the families of victims who died in the collapse of the building. An RT article on April 16th reported that Saudi Arabia appears to be blackmailing the U.S., saying that it would sell off American assets worth a 12-digit figure sum in dollars if Congress passes a bill allowing the Saudi government to be held responsible for those events. The warning was delivered by Saudi Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir last month during a visit to Washington, the New York Times reported. He said his country would sell up to $750 billion in U.S. Treasury securities and other assets before the bill puts them in jeopardy. If we go back to some of the questions I mentioned, if there were no planes involved, therefore there would be no Saudi nationals, and therefore why would the U.S. Congress seek to put blame on Saudi Arabia and force them to pay for something that Saudi nationals did not directly do? If we follow the assumption for a moment that any story the mainstream media covers is a distraction for something else going on, what is this story attempting to cover up? 9/11 was arguably one of the more emotionally charged events in recent U.S. history. Given the rebellion that is starting to rise up within the U.S. related to shootings and police abuse, and the release of information showing that UN troops and vehicles are now allegedly on U.S. soil, the release of this report could be timed as a distraction for something going on in the U.S. If we look at the events in Turkey, and if we consider the information offered by Perkins moments ago, the events in Turkey appear more and more to be a staging event for the creation of an Islamic superstate, and it may also be a cover for some kind of activity against Iran involving Israel, and perhaps more details may be revealed in the coming weeks. In the show summary for the story, a link to a PDF document from the U.S. intelligence website showing the 28 pages will be available for those wishing to view them. The full interview with Perkins will be included in the show summary as well, explaining the full process. In financial news, for those who are listening to CVN for the first time this week and who do not yet fully understand the nature of the current Western financial paradigm, there's going to be a lot of hard learning to go through. The bad news is that everyone is going to have to learn it. The good news, however, is that the sooner one learns this and the sooner one begins to adapt to the emerging financial paradigm and reality that is unfolding, the less painful and shocking it will be when it finally hits everyone else in the world. The following video was sent to me, and it may be a good reinforcement for many, but also a tool of meaningful information for others. It is an interview given by G. Edward Griffin, author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, on financialsurvivalradio.com. For those unfamiliar with Jekyll Island, this is the island where many of the financial power players seeking to take control of the U.S. economy around 1910, they met on this island to plan the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Keep in mind, this interview was done in 2013, and the author wrote the book to which he refers many years before. So the warning signs have been around for a very long time for those who were willing and open to look for them.
Is our system of money in the United States just one big scam?
Well, actually, that's the short answer, but that's not an answer that people really can understand, because all of us, including myself, we were raised with the concept that our money system was very sound. It was part of the United States government. We had the Treasury looking after it, and we had the Federal Reserve System looking after it, and all those things. So, we were raised thinking that it was the kind of a system that was stable, and it was put in place to protect us and to stabilize the economy and all of that sort of thing. And so when somebody comes along and says it's a scam, that's so far off the track that most people just cannot even consider that's true. But nevertheless, that is the short answer, and that's the answer I came to after quite a bit of research. I spent probably 7 years of intensive research trying to figure out what the Federal Reserve System is and what it has done to our money system, and I came inexorably to that conclusion. And the reason I say it is this. If you back off and look at the Federal Reserve, and that's really the topic of my book, The Creature from Jekyll Island is a second look at the Federal Reserve System. When you look at what the Federal Reserve is, it's not a government agency, it's a cartel. Believe it or not, our money system is operated, controlled totally by a cartel. No different than an oil cartel or a a banana cartel, happens to be a banking cartel. And the people that created it met in secret back in 1910 on a little island off the coast of Georgia. It's called Jekyll Island. And that's the reason I called my book The Creature from Jekyll Island. It's a real island. And back in those days, it was completely owned by a small group of billionaires from New York City, people like J.P. Morgan, William Rockefeller, and their business associates. This is where their families went to spend the cold winter months. It's a beautiful place. You can visit it today and see those mansions. And, of course, you would have to visit that big clubhouse that's still standing. That's where they met. And for a whole week, they sat around a table there on Jekyll Island in secret, told nobody they were going. For years afterwards, they denied that they went. They even changed their names when they took the trip, all kinds of secrecy. And they sat around a table and they created the banking cartel that would control the nation's money supply. They took it back to Washington after they were all done and gave it to the politicians. They took off the name cartel across the top and wrote in the phrase Federal Reserve Act. They passed it into law. And now all of us are required by law to live under the conditions of a banking cartel that was completely drafted in private and in secret by the banks themselves. And like any other banking or any other cartel, whether it's a banking cartel or a banana cartel or an oil cartel, whatever, the whole purpose of these organizations is to further the objective of the members of the cartel. That's it, period, nothing else. So if you wonder why in recent months that during this financial crisis that all of the money that's being created out of nothing, these billions and trillions of dollars, you may have noticed, where is it going?
Yeah.
It's going to the banks.
Yes. Yes.
Well, of course it's going to the banks because the banks are making the decisions. This is a banking cartel. And once you understand what it is, you realize that this whole system of bailouts and all of this quantitative easing and all of these fancy names they give to it is nothing but legalized plunder of the American taxpayer, because all of that money comes out of our pockets either directly in the form of taxes or indirectly in the form of inflation. And that's where most of the action is going to go on, is through inflation. So yes, it is a scam. It's a scam by which a very powerful but very smart group of people who make the banking industry have figured out how to get into the pocketbooks of the average American and make them like it, because they're told that it's all for the best of America. So if that isn't a scam, I don't know what is.
That a lot of what you predicted in that book, which was published, 17 years ago, is now coming true. For example, Chapter 2, the title, The Name of the Game is Bailout. I mean, how in the world were you able to see all of this coming more than 17 years ago?
Well, it really wasn't very difficult. It's just a matter of seeing what they were already doing. And also, it's a matter of understanding what they were. As I just said a moment ago, once you understand that this is a banking cartel, and that the whole purpose of this cartel is to further the interests of the banks, once you understand that and really get your mind around it, then it's pretty easy to predict what these people are going to do. Regardless of what happens, they're going to do those things which fatten the pocketbooks of the banking fraternity. And it was designed back in 1910 on that meeting, in that meeting on Jekyll Island. They talked about how this thing would work, why they were doing it, and one of the objectives was to bail them out, because they knew the system they were putting together was not sustainable, would go on for a long time, but they knew it eventually would come unglued, or they felt it could come unglued. It always had previously in history. When you create money out of nothing, all of a sudden, the money supply is completely removed from anything of tangible value. And so if people can create money out of nothing, as they do through the Federal Reserve System, you know what they're going to do? They're going to create money out of nothing. And they're going to create more of it and more of it and more of it until finally the supply just floods through the economy, and it's much greater than the goods and services that chase after it, and you've got this thing called inflation. And eventually that has a payoff. It's like giving somebody cocaine. Eventually they need more and more of it, and finally they have so much of it it's going to kill them. And so they go into a coma, and then you call in the drug pusher and says, I know how to fix this guy, let's give him some more cocaine. So they knew from history that these systems always collapse, and they figured down the line this one was going to collapse too. So the question was what to do about it. Just stand around and let it fall? No. Let's make it appear like a government agency. Let's get the government involved as a partner. Let's get these politicians committed to bail us out using taxpayers' dollars. It was all decided way back in 1910 and 1913. So I knew that. And I also knew about certain laws of economics, which were pretty obvious from even a high school kid that spends a little time looking at the history of money and banking throughout history. This is very simple history. Banks always get into partnership with government so they can plunder the people, and the economic system always falls apart as a result of it. That's happened over and over and over again. So once you just have a few little facts like that in mind, it's not difficult to see where the system is going. It's just like looking at like a graph. You've got a bunch of dots, and if you got 3 dots lined up in a row, one for this year, one for the year before, and one for the year before that, and they're all in a straight line, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to lay a ruler on those 3 dots and project where the whole thing is headed. Yeah. Unless there are some drastic changes, in the way things are unfolding, we're going to go exactly where we're headed. So way back in 1994, when I wrote the book, I laid that mental ruler on the graph, and I could see where we were when the Federal Reserve System was created. I could see where we were also in 1994 when I wrote the book, and I just projected into the future, and voila, that's exactly where we are now. Yeah. So it didn't take an awful lot of brains to do that.
Well, there weren't too many people who were putting it together back then, I'll say that, at least not out publicly. But, most people still don't understand. You were talking about the cartel idea, that the Federal Reserve is this big cartel. Of course, anybody knows that the more business you have with a cartel, the more danger that you're in. And many of us don't fully understand that our money, the very money that we hold, that we save, that we spend, may be one of the most volatile and dangerous instruments that there could possibly be.
Well, money is, it's right at the core of everything, isn't it? It's the medium of exchange, and just about anything you can think of that you want to either do or have somehow gets expressed in terms of money along the way. And you have to either pay people to do the things for you that you want them to, or you pay them to give you the things that you want them to give you. In other words, money is a measure of the degree to which you can command the services of other people. So it's power, isn't it? Money is power. And, they say power is money. Well, it's kind of a circular thing, but those who have the ability to create money and to use it and to determine who gets it and what interest rates they pay for it, how readily it's available to expand their industries, those people sit at the very apex of power in a modern society. So when you look around and see who's running the world today, if you really understand what I've just said, you don't have to look necessarily in the halls of Congress or government. You look in the halls of money, because those are the people who can buy the politicians, who can support their campaigns, who can give them the media exposure they need to get the popular support to be elected and so forth. It's the money that really controls the politicians today. And once you understand that reality, then a lot of things begin to make sense, especially when you're looking at what's happening in the United States today. We get the idea that Congress is somehow controlling those banks and making them toe the line and all that sort of thing. But, it's really the other way around. If you really look, it's the bankers that are calling the tune, and the congressmen are doing the jig. So, anyway, that's just my observation, and it's certainly borne out by history.
As you heard, this is what we have been witnessing, the buyout of politicians and the increased control of corporations and the commercial rule over humans through the commercial legal system. People are awakening and realizing that things must now change. People are increasingly standing up and speaking out for this change. However, at a higher level, humanity still needs some help from those within certain corridors of power to take on those who have been claiming this power and control over humanity and the planet. That help may be starting to appear in numerous different ways, and in this next story, we'll look at one such possibility. For the majority of listeners, it is not much of a surprise that the current economic paradigm, based on debt and worthless fiat paper money, is in the process of collapse. Mathematically, the system could never be sustained forever, as we heard from G. Edward Griffin a few moments ago, and those in control knew a day would come when it would collapse. Those in control probably hoped, however, that when this day finally came, that they would be also in control of the primary resources that would form the replacement paradigm, so that they could continue their domination of humanity and the planet. Those whom I call the global cabal, and in particular the banking part of this cabal, deviously set up the plan for the enslavement and control of humanity, and somehow managed to get humans dumbed down enough so that they would willingly consent to being controlled by their systems and structures. Over the last few years, the word has been increasing about a return to a gold standard economic paradigm. This was taken away from the world back during the wars, and it was taken away from the U.S. in the early 70s. As the fiat system began its decline, and as the mathematical end came closer and closer, hints were being planted about how things might change. In 2012, an article appeared in the leading business publication Forbes. In October of that year, 2012, the following was reported. The ability to create gold from the base material has eluded alchemists since the Middle Ages, but 2 U.S. university professors have found a way to produce small amounts of gold using metal-loving bacteria to make the magic. The key words, I think, from 2012 were microbial and small. Only small amounts of gold could be processed with this method. The hint being fed to the public at this time, don't get any ideas about doing this for yourself. It is a long, scientific, and very expensive process. Arguably, this could have been one of possibly numerous attempts to plant seeds of what was to come. And again, those in control believed that they had control over the ideas and processes that would allow them to stay in control. The world changed, and humans continued to wake up in ever-increasing numbers to further challenge the status quo and also further challenge the power and control certain people were claiming to have over humanity and how they lived. Fast forward to today, and we are seeing the structures once controlled by this global cabal being exposed and, in some cases, taken down by the truths that are now becoming known. The current economic paradigm is dying, and a new one is in the process of being birthed. And it seems that this paradigm is reintroducing the gold standard, or possibly some form of resources-based paradigm, of which gold may play the lead role. Historically, change has always come very slowly, perhaps because of the control of the global cabal, but also perhaps by necessity, because humanity could not handle too much truth at one time. With the increasing vibration and frequency of the planet and of humanity in general, this process has been accelerated, and some people are adapting better than others in handling the mass information overload and shift at this time. The economy is in transition from a worthless fiat-based structure, which the West has controlled for at least the last 100 years, to a resources gold-based paradigm that is being introduced in the East and led by the BRICS nations. This, however, is only a transition. As the suppressed technologies are released, humanity will be able to clean its air, water, and land, and also produce almost everything, if not everything, through 3D, 4D, and 5D printing, or perhaps via a more advanced form of replication, such as that seen on Star Trek. At that time, money, as we currently know it, will cease to have a function in the world. It is a day that the global cabal has been dreading, and they have been desperately trying to delay this day from coming, if ever. They are unable to stop it, however. As we enter into the transitional economic paradigm of gold or resource-backed economics, the seeds are now also being planned for the phase-out of gold. In what could be an intriguing development for not only science, but also the birthing geoeconomic paradigm, an article appeared on the geopolitics.co website on July 14th, and this article reports that in another challenge to the Khazarian Mafia's Babylonian paper magic financial system and the entire pyramid of cartels, 2 Russian scientists revealed a groundbreaking scientific discovery that is expected to change every system built for the last millennia. Chemical transmutation, specifically involving lead into gold, was first heard within the occult science known as alchemy. Then it was that same occultism that continued to suppress using the national security all-encompassing excuse against free energy activist John Bedini, who successfully transmuted copper into gold by using 5,000 Celsius degrees of heat, further explaining why countries above the Ring of Fire, like the Philippines, have so much natural gold deposit that's been extracted by foreign mining firms decades ago. It would be a very fair question to ask, if the public is only finding out about this now, would those who have been in control of the planet already known about this decades and perhaps even centuries ago and used the process to make all the gold they needed? This is indeed a very challenging question to answer, and if I had to speculate, and I admit I am only speculating, here is my current theory why they did not. There are 2 primary reasons. One reason I propose, and this is my speculation as to why the global banking cartel never used this technology to produce gold, was because they never envisioned a day would come when they would begin to lose all their power and their wealth. They may have thought that it was more than enough to control what was already available, and as long as the general public never learned the truth about transmutation and alchemy, they would have enough power. The second reason becomes perhaps a bit more clear in the article itself. The article writes that the reason could be capitalism. The profit-oriented capitalism, in conjunction with the monetary-based economic system, has aborted humanity's march towards space-age progress. It has deterred us from achieving our full potential. All technologies that have been discovered and are deliberately suppressed by patent acquisition and shelving can make the existing control paradigm obsolete overnight. Those who are addicted to these control systems need to be neutralized if we are to make it to the next level of our evolution that's been delayed for more than 100 years. The article explains that this is what the BRICS alliance of countries are trying to do. According to the article, for the last several years since its inception, the BRICS alliance tried several methods and strategies to start this paradigm-shifting change that is not only expected to affect their own populations, but those of the entire planet. In order to weaken the clout of the Rothschild banking dynasty that is protecting the status quo, both Russia and China started buying vast quantities of gold available in the open market. This didn't cause a significant increase in the price of gold and silver right away because those prices were already under intense systematic rigging in the first place in order to protect the integrity of the legal tender global exchange currency, meaning the Federal Reserve's U.S. dollar. The Western banking cartel controls the gold price for now, and George Soros made over $2 trillion betting on the Asian gold mines during the Brexit vote. So, he has the money to continue trying to fund the Western power machine. Therefore, another strategy is required because the BRICS alliance, according to the article, are not interested in any kind of war scenario, since they believe that this would lead to a nuclear, mutually assured destruction. Without war, how could BRICS pull this off? This was done by announcing the transmutation process. Once the East controlled enough physical gold, the announcement could then be made allowing this information to be known by everyone. And with this, the global economic paradigm would have no choice but to shift significantly. According to the article, This discovery was made possible by two Russian theoretical and experimental scientists who were trying to figure out how to fuel a spacecraft using any element found in space. The transmutation process does not involve nuclear reaction and heavy water. The economic consequence of the industrial scale of such a process cannot be projected at this point, they say. The repercussions of this revolution will be felt in the energy sector, medicine, industry, and perhaps would also open up new industries, brand new industries that will have enormous humanitarian implications. What is most important to bear in mind is that what we are talking about here is a ready-made industrial approach that will be capable of producing target products in industrial quantities in a matter of months. The Russian patent for the process has been given the designation RU-2563511 and was awarded to Tamara Sano and Viktor Chernyshov, those credited with discovering the process. The article does go into some of the more science-based information behind the discovery and the process itself. What will likely be more exciting for most listeners, I suspect, is the conclusion of the article. The article closes with the following. There's no doubt that there will be a creative explosion all over the planet when all of these technology and equipment are made available on the market soon. When there's an oversupply of any element, naturally the price of that element will go down to the point of insignificance. The anathema to the scarcity-based economic system that we are currently forced to swallow. Beside its scientifically groundbreaking significance, the conference was also held in the headquarters of the global banking industry and political epicenter of the West, in Switzerland, which should repel all notion of it being just a mere Russian propaganda, or that turning iron or lead into gold is not a fringe science at all, but it is real and replicable, and the technology to do it is officially available to the world. In the final analysis, the full utilization of all scientific discoveries could make all conventional institutions, for example, educational, banking, finance, religion, and even the police and military, obsolete. A link to a video of the conference held in Switzerland where the announcement was made will be included in the show summary for those wishing to learn more. Also in the show summary, some links to other information of historical background relating to alchemy, and the article itself will have science-based information for those interested in the science component of the discovery. In general news, we have been hearing this term rule of law lately in a few news stories. One from last week involving German Chancellor Merkel while she was in China, and this week the Turkish military involved in the attempted coup were claiming to want to restore rule of law. This term, rule of law, is interesting in that there appears to be a global hypocrisy relating to the understanding and application of this term. The US Legal.com website, for example, states the following for this term rule of law. According to the philosophy of rule of law, the law of the land is supreme over the acts of government as well as private persons, and the relationship between the state and the individual are regulated by the law of the land. Rule of law signifies a legal political regime to protect the rights of citizens from arbitrary and abusive use of governmental power. The rule of law guarantees government accountability and protects the social rights of individuals. The existence of an independent and transparent judiciary is a fundamental aspect of the rule of law. Black's Law Dictionary, the standard that appears to be the most generally accepted in Western law circles in defining legal terms, states that the rule of law is this: the predominance, that is, absolute of an ordinary law over every citizen, regardless of that citizen's power. According to the World Justice Project, the definition of the rule of law is a system in which the following four universal principles are upheld. 1. The government and its officials and agents, as well as individuals and private entities, are accountable under the law. 2. The laws are clear, publicized, stable, and just. They are applied evenly and protect fundamental rights, including the security of persons and property and certain core human rights. 3. The process by which the laws are enacted, administered, and enforced is accessible, fair, and efficient. And 4. Justice is delivered timely by competent, ethical, and independent representatives and neutral who are of sufficient number, have adequate resources, and reflect the makeup of the communities they serve. Note that the U.S. legal definition says that law should include government as well as private persons. The Black's definition says that this law presides over every citizen, regardless of that citizen's power. The World Justice Project expands its definition slightly by including government, its officials, its agents, as well as individuals and private entities. 3 different legal sources, and yet the definition is slightly different in each case, and therefore can be open to different interpretations depending upon the legal counsel, the judge, and the jurisdiction of the court itself. Is it any wonder, therefore, that humans and our planet consistently get screwed in courts of law? Now, note what these definitions do not say. They make no mention of corporate entities. I believe that this is why trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, the TTIP, TISA, NAFTA, and CAFTA, and any others are inherently dangerous to humanity and the planet. Recall that the jurisdiction of Western courts, the public ones at least, are based in admiralty or commercial law. When one goes into a commercial court, one is required to unknowingly consent to the commercial authority or jurisdiction of that court. Given that the courts are commercial entities, with the mandate to rule on commercial disputes between commercial entities, is it not hypocritical and indeed even criminal to exclude commercial entities from the definition of rule of law and then apply that commercial definition upon human beings without their informed consent that they are seen as corporate entities within that courtroom? An argument could therefore be made that rule of law, as defined in the 3 cases above, does not exist in any courtroom having commercial law as the foundation for its jurisdiction, regardless of the country where that court is located. Therefore, what is it exactly that leaders are demanding when they say they want to see a return to rule of law in another country, when it is obviously not present within the legal system of the country of the Western leader who is making such a demand? As one may now observe, although leaders may speak of the importance of rule of law, but it is clear, as with many common terms used in the legal language, that there appears to be a different definition and application of this term when it comes to national and global governance. Recently, CVN reported how Poland was attempting to take back national control of its Supreme Court. The EU is threatening to punish Poland for doing so. If a true definition of rule of law is being applied equally and fairly across all EU states, what reason, therefore, would the unelected leadership of the EU have for making such demand upon Poland, unless an implementation of true rule of law would therefore put the EU and its leadership at risk of being held accountable under that rule of law. Perhaps the Polish government's attempt to take back control of its Supreme Court could be an example of resisting EU commercial rule given the force of law. In the current legal system, it is not about what is truly law. In other words, law that deals with harm to others, harm to property, harm to the planet, and the integrity in fulfilling agreements, commercial or otherwise. It is only about the interpretation of rules, and it is the many rules that have been created by one individual or a group and then approved by a certain other group of people, and then these rules are applied upon a group of unsuspecting people without their informed consent. This is the criminally fraudulent nature of the legal system. It is neither fair nor is it just. A cleverly disguised language of rules that benefit only the people who are educated enough to interpret and argue those rules, or those who are wealthy enough to pay the educated ones to interpret those rules to their benefit. This is what G. Edward Griffin was mentioning about the power of money, being able to buy people to give you what you want or to buy the products and services that one needs. Over to tech-related news this week, and we look at this new distraction that also appears to be causing some chaos. On the very same day, 28 classified pages about 9/11 were released, and a military coup took place in Turkey, and yet another false flag event in France happened. Many zombies of our Western society were busy declaring that they finally caught a Pokemon Pikachu, assuming they weren't run over by a car, or drove their car into a tree, or accidentally walked off a cliff in the process. All of which actually did happen, by the way. Some listeners may already be familiar with a new game app called Pokemon Go. I admit I have no knowledge nor understanding of the Pokemon game and have never felt any interest or desire in the game or any other game of its kind, to be honest. I would love to spend preferably more time off the internet and out more connected in nature and water. An article appearing on the CorbettReport.com website on July 13th brings some potentially disturbing news about this trend that is disturbing enough by itself. According to the article, privacy advocates, and that is the establishment term meaning normal human beings, celebrated earlier this week as the U.S. Congress rejected yet another attempt to expand the Patriot Act snooping provisions. House Resolution 5606, better known by its Orwellian name, the Anti-Terrorism Information Sharing is Strength Act, would have allowed Big Brother to access Americans' financial information based on what the government deems to be suspicious activity. Given that the Department of Homeland Security has labeled such things as using binoculars, paying with cash, or even appearing normal as possible terrorist activity in the past, thus making pretty much every human being a possible terrorist, everyone can breathe a sigh of relief that the bill failed. But don't breathe that sigh too deeply, because exactly as that threat to privacy was being extinguished, another one was rising to take its place. It goes by the name of Pokemon Go, and it is a so-called augmented reality game that allows users to capture, train, and battle virtual Pokemon by chasing them around through real-world environments with your smartphone. For those unfamiliar with augmented reality gaming, it's the type of game where one tracks virtual characters or objects that appear on their smartphones through real-world environments. The Pokemon Go game is prompting scores of people out into the streets to go chasing for wild Pokemon to capture. It is also prompting heists, violence, hoaxes, and hysteria. The line between the gaming world and what we currently think of as reality is getting more blurred with each passing week and month. The dangers are more than just the game itself, however. There are also the terms and conditions, as well as the background of the game itself, that are worthy of concern. The article continues. Firstly, the app requires an excessive amount of permissions on a user's device, including the ability to read your contacts, find accounts on your device, and access your camera. The app even requires full access to a user's Google account, which it can then use to read your emails, send emails from your account, browse your Google Drive documents and photos, and so on. But apparently that's just a quote-unquote mistake and will be quote-unquote corrected soon. Secondly, the game's privacy policy contains such gems as we may disclose any information about you or your authorized child that is in our possession or control to government or law enforcement officials or private parties. So some may not feel any concern, believing that they have nothing to hide, or perhaps at least not yet. However, the news about this app gets worse. The article also adds this information. The maker of the app is Niantic Labs. Never heard of them? That's because until last year they were an internal startup of none other than Google, the NSA-linked Big Brother company. Even now, Google remains one of Niantic's major backers. Niantic was founded by John Hanke, who also founded Keyhole Incorporated, the mapping company which was created with seed money from In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital arm, and which was eventually rolled into Google Maps. So yes, the Pokemon game, currently taking the internet by storm and scooping up all their data, including activities, movements, and communications, was created by a CIA-linked businessman who formulated and evolved his company at Google. Recall that CVN has been trying to teach listeners about the idea of informed consent. Those who have downloaded this app have just given uninformed consent because one can be very sure that 99.5% of the users of this app have no idea to what they have consented to. The legal agreements are becoming very similar to omnibus legislation, something that is very common in the U.S. and becoming increasingly more common in countries like Canada. The base legislation is one thing, but then there is a long list of added conditions attached to that base legislation. Most politicians don't read omnibus bills because they are too long, and they give uninformed consent to corporate interests. Individuals give uninformed consent for their private information to be obtained and monitored without necessarily knowing that they have done so. Here is the next issue. The article wrote about the popularity of the game, writing the following. To put into perspective just how popular this game is, it topped the App Store's top grossing category within 24 hours of its release. Now, just 1 week out, it has been downloaded an estimated 7.5 million times alone in the U.S. and is generating an estimated 1.6 million a day for Nintendo. But here's the truly mind-boggling part. In the first 2 days of trading after the game's release, Nintendo's market value rose a staggering $7.5 billion. Even though the game has not officially made it into Canada, Canadians are benefiting indirectly from it. It was reported on Global News in Canada on the same day that anyone who's paying into the Canada Pension Plan should thank all the Pidgey hunters out there. Nintendo's stock has shot up, and the Canada Pension Plan has invested in a lot of it. In its March 31st, 2016 public disclosure, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board revealed that they held 318,000 shares in the video game company, at the time worth about $59 million. After Pokemon Go's launch, that stock is now worth more than $86 million. Global News offers a report on the health benefits of the app, explaining that it is getting people out walking, running, and biking more, which contributes, allegedly, to greater health, although I personally might question this. Global News, by also addressing the windfall that this stock brings to people's pension plans, most will only see the bottom line of their retirement benefits and not look at the bigger picture of further harm and enslavement that this app is bringing to people of the West, especially to keep them distracted from all the current events being exposed at this time. And the zombie phenomenon seems to go on. Please choose not to be one of them. Finally, in health-related news, for the vast majority of listeners, you don't need me to tell you how things are speeding up and how issues are coming at us so quickly. It seems like the next one hits us just as we are finishing up with another. Or we're getting hit on multiple levels and frantically trying to multitask while dealing with our current reality and not losing our sanity in the process. Long-time listeners will benefit from this reminder, and new listeners are gently guided to pay close attention to observe whether or not you are experiencing what is being described in the following video and how it may relate to your awakening and growth at this time. The following is an energy update offered by Lee Harris. I personally am observing memories and issues coming up from my past, and I'm realizing that these have to be dealt with and released, preferably as compassionately and as lovingly as possible, while also being as forgiving as I can to myself and to any others who may be involved. Extreme consciousness is arriving now. Here is Lee Harris.
The energies of the extremes are certainly hitting us in a very big way. This will carry on as a theme for several years. Extremes are going to be the way that consciousness continues to evolve and show up on the planet. But in the last few weeks particularly, we have seen these pulses really hitting hard. So for those of you who are sensitive, this can literally result in the extremes of your experience. So you can go from the highs to the lows, from the extrovert to the introvert in very fast ways. When we think about the heart consciousness and the consciousness in general rising on the planet, there has long been this talk of things have to come to the surface for cleansing and for healing. And in my last energy update, I spoke about the healing of unconsciousness. This has just been playing out in a really big way here in the US, particularly in the last couple of weeks. Unconscious issues and division issues coming to the surface to be put right in everybody's view, plain view, up close and personal. Uncomfortable, yes, but what you'll notice as these, if you like, cleansings happen is things tend to pulse dark light, dark light, dark light. So your own feelings will go from dark to light. So, for example, with the recent spate of shootings and race issues in America, on the one hand, it is bringing to the surface a great deal of healing, and on the other hand, it's bringing to the surface a great deal of conflict and agitation. And that's just what's going on in America right now. You can apply that to any country in the world and see what's happening in each country. So, as this is going on as a collective theme, you will notice yourself letting go of agitation, frustration, emotions. The positive side is that you can turn it into larger awareness, a deeper sense of purpose, and as I mentioned on the last update, creativity. Whenever we go through cleanses, whenever we go through purging, which is happening planet-wide, new energy gets released and new potential gets released. So again, the most positive aspect of all of this for many of you right now is going to be new creation. Those of you who are really mad that I'm saying that because you're under it right now, it will come. Remember that nothing stays the same. Whenever we go through tough times, whether that's for a few hours or a few weeks, everything will pass and everything changes. That's the law of energy. So if you're in a tough spot right now, focus on the things that can get you out of it. But we're moving at such an accelerated pace with the amount of change and pioneering energy on the planet. I mean, I'm kind of laughing as I'm saying this because, of course, being in New York, which is a total fireball of all of that, this is the perfect place to remind you needing to calm and center yourself is vital, not just for respite from what's going on, but most importantly, to power yourself for the next phases. Some of you are already feeling really strong and like you have a brand new stamina and a brand new capacity to move faster than ever before. Some of you are a little bit afraid of that brand new stamina. There is an enormous amount of letting go happening on the planet, which when we get very habituated with our emotional patterns, our attachments to people, our attachments to places, a lot of history can come up for us when we're letting go and changing who we are. So it's quite normal to be thinking about the past, daydreaming about the past, connecting with the past in memories as you start to step forward into your new sense of purpose. And that new sense of purpose is far more collective and humanitarian than this planet has ever seen. That brings up intimacy issues, up close and personal. It tests you, how close can I feel to my fellow man, my fellow woman? How close can I feel to myself, and how awake can I be and how much of the time? So it can be a very edgy process. It's not always comfortable, it's not always pretty, but the more you keep honoring the fact that you're in this process and inviting yourself to continue to open and finding the things that work for you, finding what you need on a daily basis for wellness, for well-being, then you start to support this process and can access the potency of it rather than feeling dragged underneath the destruction side of it or the side of it that really challenges you to let go of the past. So, we're in an incredibly strong time of fusion energy. So parts of you are fusing together and getting ready to become something new. It's explosive, it's powerful. It's an exciting time to be alive, even as we have to come to terms with the things that make us feel sad or bring grief to the surface, to the unconsciousness that we're seeing healing slowly but surely in our world. So, big love to all of you. Keep looking after yourselves and each other. These are very, very, very close to the heart times. So, be very gentle with your needs and your emotions and the way that you're looking after your body. We're out on the road. We're about to start the East Coast leg of this tour that's taking us across North America. So I'm holding energy tune-up evening events, and with the support of Stephen Washington, I'm doing one-day soul ignition workshops. So this week we're in New York, Toronto, and Ottawa. Next week we are in, my mind is going blank, Annapolis, back to New York for a one-day workshop, and Asheville and Atlanta. And then there are more dates in September and October. If you can't make it to any of those dates but want to work with me in a deeper way, the monthly members club, the portal, is where you receive the new MP3 and also the monthly online Q&A broadcast. The MP3 this month is the big breakthrough. It's a channeled experience around sound healing and around enlightenment and around why you are perfect as you are and how to access the truth of that every single day.
Links to Harris's website and his blog page will appear in the show summary for the story, as will the video for his energetic update. In this week's final word. Earlier in the newscast, we looked at this term, rule of law. In last week's newscast, I reported on German Chancellor Angela Merkel's attempt to address rule of law with the Chinese government, and Merkel also spoke to university students on the importance of rule of law. In this week's lead story about Turkey, we heard how the Turkish military was wanting to govern Turkey with a peace council while maintaining the rule of law as a priority. We also looked at this term in the newscast to understand better what it really means. I'd like to look at what Chancellor Merkel had to say about rule of law from the article last week. The article that reported this story also wrote the following. First, Merkel gave a speech at Nanjing University in Beijing where she focused on the importance of the rule of law, noting that only an efficient rule of law maintains the trust of the citizens, and including foreign enterprises. This can only be achieved by a rule of law rather than rule by law, she told the students. Merkel said This at a time when the Chinese government has increasingly tightened control on media and public opinion, and arrests activists as well as journalists, including those working for major German newspapers. The Chinese government's control will most likely also tighten on foreign non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, once the new law on foreign NGOs comes into effect in January of 2017. China passed a new law restricting the work of foreign organizations in late April, which concerns roughly 7,000 foreign organizations. Worries even among the largest German political foundations are high, and this visit probably did not change this. Now, I could probably go on at length about the corruption of NGOs and how they are used as alleged humanitarian tools while working behind the scenes to contribute to the destabilization of a targeted country. However, I will not focus on that at this time. The West loves to claim that China is guilty of human rights abuses, and no doubt China, and arguably every country worldwide, are guilty of human rights abuses and crimes against humanity under various interpretations. The West will try to claim that China limits freedoms of its citizens. Western countries, including Canada, accuse China of having a closed society, and even Russia has been criticized of this to some degree. Yet, citizens of the West, arguably, are subjected to a form of control and enslavement that is just simply less visible. When people are being very visibly controlled and oppressed, it is easy to see, and therefore to accuse. It is not so visible in Western countries. Western countries have used fraud, deceit, and other tactics to get their citizens to unknowingly consent to the oppressions placed upon them, and to accept the illusion of freedom and democracy that they are a part of. By using the media, Western citizens are made to believe that things are much worse in other countries, and that governments in other countries are worse, and therefore those in the West should feel grateful and happy that they are free. Yet, they are not. 2 weeks ago on the newscast, I gave a list of things that essentially prove that we are not as free as we would like to think we are. There are very few things that, at some level or another, can be done without some kind of government approval, or at least government control or influence, directly or indirectly. Let's explore a bit more deeply this Western claim of China limiting the freedom of its citizens. The following thought occurred to me last week. Those of you who are parents, do you let your young children do everything they want? There are, no doubt, some parents who do allow this, but most parents will generally not allow their children to do something that the parent believes may be dangerous or inappropriate for the child. Perhaps as a parent, you enforced a discipline on your child or your children until they were able to establish a pattern for themselves and then either choose it or not continue it. Putting a child into a sports program or a music program or a fitness program, even if they did not want it at first, because you believed it would give them a better lifestyle in the end. What has the Western lifestyle given to its people in the illusion of freedom? Invisible suppression of people through commercial rules given the force of law within the illusion of freedom in a so-called democracy. Mostly overweight and unhealthy children, and adults too, by allowing unhealthy food, water, air, medicines, and more. A society addicted to news, sports, entertainment, and fast food, a couch potato lifestyle that is incapable of thinking for itself. When members of society do begin to think for themselves and question the authority imposed upon them, they are branded as terrorists or some other kind of threat. A society that surrenders more and more of its freedoms under manufactured threats to perpetuate the power that is concentrated in the hands of an increasingly smaller group of people. What else do we have here in the West? We have a society where elections can be rigged and manipulated to create the illusion that one's vote means something when it does not always mean something. We have a society where permission is required to be born, to die, and almost everything in between. A government will not allow a citizen to die mercifully when in extreme pain, and yet the government will willingly and legally take a young life to war to kill innocent others on their behalf for the control of wealth or natural resources in the name of democracy or freedom or in the name of God. Western children are taught that things are worse elsewhere in the world and that they should celebrate and promote westernized democracy and the now dying American dream. The list goes on. In the Western illusion of freedom, the people have only become unhealthy, controlled sheep. I can only speculate on what life may have given people in China or possibly Russia to a certain degree, because I obviously did not grow up in a Russian or Chinese environment. Although I may not be able to describe various oppressions that may or may not have been present in those societies, I can observe the consequences. What I am now seeing is that citizens from China, and perhaps also from Russia, are better disciplined and physically healthier and stronger to deal with the world. They, especially the Asian cultures, have a much more humble nature and are willing to do whatever it takes to get ahead, even if it means doing jobs that most Westerners would never touch. Most Asian cultures have various different physical programs and self-defense programs, meaning their minds and bodies are much stronger than those of Western people. The food in these cultures was generally much healthier before Western countries came along and forced their fast food restaurants and other dangerous corporate products and services upon their society. As John Perkins reminded us this week, this is one way Western countries try to dumb down or control other countries, weakening them through the introduction of unhealthy Western practices. Those of Eastern Europe are given the American dream to strive for, and they grow up wanting to live in the U.S. And once they get an American passport, they may suddenly realize that they are now trapped under the control of the IRS, the American tax system that forces Americans to pay taxes even if they live and work in other countries. Is this freedom? Is this a dream to aspire toward? People of the East are fed the dream that life in the West is the life to have. People in the West are fed the message that life is dangerous and much poorer around the world, so we should be grateful for what we have, even if we are slaves. We have more than others around the world. Yet, it appears that very little of it is true. It is all in the interpretation. Some say the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. Some also say that the grass is greener over the septic system. By virtue of having been held back from the so-called freedoms of the Western world and having been relieved of the influences of Western aid organizations, the Asians and Russians are now demonstrating that they are now healthier and stronger to deal with a world that most people in Western countries are unable and unwilling to do. I have to wonder who came out on the better end of the deal. In my youth, I didn't originally want to study French in school when it was introduced, but my mother guided me to, and I am now glad that she did. She encouraged me to choose sports over music, and I excelled in badminton in my youth, and unfortunately I did not learn a musical instrument. I unfortunately have not maintained that physical, healthier lifestyle because I allowed myself to get sucked into the lifestyle we have created here in the West. Now, at present, I don't have badminton, I don't have tennis, and I don't have music. And this is a shame. To break an addiction to a lifestyle, sometimes it requires a tough love of sorts, and maybe, just maybe, even though the West did not see it this way by their interpretation, maybe the Asians ended up coming out on top after all. in more ways than one. Create a wonderful week until our next moment of now. So that is a sample of the unfolding higher consciousness news around the world this week. Cosmic Vision News is broadcast weekly from the CosmicVisionNews.com website. Links to stories used in this broadcast are published in the show summary available on the website. CVN can be followed through its Facebook page, Scene page, YouTube channel, as well as on Twitter, Google+, and LinkedIn. Thank you for sharing your time with me. I'm Jeffrey West, reminding you to not look back in anger, nor look forward in fear, but rather just look around you in awareness. Until our next moment of now, stay grounded in love, hold the vision of light and peace in your hearts, and keep your eyes to the skies. Disclosure is unfolding all around you. Namaste.